Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Carla, and I'll be leading today's weekly walk through the Arthur Ross Pinetum. But thank you so much for joining us today, Wednesday, January 11th, 2023. I have to remember to say 2023. We'll be starting in just a little bit, but thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate that all of you continue to join us for our in-person programming when you come and see us in the park, as well as our virtual programs like these weekly walks. We love seeing you, whether it's in the park or online. All right, and I see already there is a comment about a pinetum, and yes, we're going to talk about that, but a pinetum is like an arboretum that focuses just on pine trees, and that's exactly what we're going to explore today on our weekly walk, the Arthur Ross Pinetum, and we'll touch briefly on who exactly Arthur Ross was. Before we get started, just a reminder of some of your Zoom tools that you can use throughout our program today. So remember that you can say hello and add comments and feedback using the Q&A feature that you'll find along the bottom there. And use the chat feature for your comments and to say hello. And you can use the Q&A feature if you have any questions. Be sure to use that Q&A feature if you have any questions. And my colleague Desiree will be on the back end answering your questions. Also, you can use the live transcript for closed captioning if you would like to use that. All right. And so continuing, as always, our mission here at the Conservancy is to preserve and celebrate Central Park as a sanctuary from the pace and pressures of city life, enhancing the enjoyment and well-being of all. And today we're going to be spending time, as I said, in the Pinetum, talking a little bit about how pine trees sort of enhance our own well-being in winter, even on dull, gray, cloudy winter days. We're just taking a short little walk today. It's been pretty cold lately, feeling a little bit raw. So sometimes it can feel challenging for folks to get out, even when it's so cold. But I encourage you to try if you can, even if it's just a short walk like the one that we're doing today. So we will start at the West 85th Street entrance and make our way past the playground towards the Pinetum. And we'll just take a little brief walk around the Pinetum and end just outside the Great Lawn. But we'll start our walk today outside of the West 85th Street entrance of the park. And of course, this is also known as Mariner's Gate. And a mariner is just another word for a sailor, but we are not going to be really encountering any bodies of water today. We're going to be staying on land. We'll make our way up the hill as we walk towards the Pinetum, and we can see the sign already is welcoming us into the park. And this hill is a little bit of a climb, but I sometimes think it's good to start off strong and get our blood pumping to keep us warm as we continue on our winter walk here. And looking out to our left here, you can kind of see how evergreens stand out in the landscape among the other deciduous trees, especially on a gray day like this. But I have to say that lately I've really been enjoying deciduous trees, just the outlines of them and how they appear against the sky, whether that sky is blue or gray. The deciduous trees and their branches, the outline almost looks like they're starting to look almost like veins to me, or a circulation system, which is sort of what they are for the tree, right? They're a circulation system, and they almost look like those illustrations you see of the veins of your lungs kind of spreading out. And I think trees, in a sense, are sort of lungs for us as well. I also notice here, in the sort of lower right-hand corner, when I look in this area, the sign that reminds me that the area that we're passing through was once the site, the location of the community of Seneca Village that existed here before the creation of Central Park. And if you haven't already, I strongly encourage you to learn more about Seneca Village. And one of the best ways is by attending one of our tours. So watch out in the chat for the link to our Seneca tour, which will be offered again very soon. If you'd like to learn more about that area, which we're passing through as we make our way to the Pinetum today. Now, I know we're going to be talking about pine trees, but I do have to point out just a couple more deciduous trees that stood out on our walk today. On my right here, I really enjoy seeing those outlined branches against the winter skyline, and whether, it's blue or gray, sometimes especially when it's gray, the light is so bright and kind of eerie looking. And these branches really stood out to me, the way that they appear against the sky. I'm just curious if anyone thinks they know what kind of tree this is. I know it's challenging because you're not seeing a full picture of the tree, you're just seeing the branches, and it's kind of a very dark, odd picture. But does anyone have a guess as to which tree this is? I see someone guessed it. That's right. So this is a ginkgo, and sort of the giveaway are those little nubby growths on the edge of the branch. Of course, the ginkgo is pretty early on in the evolution of trees, which we'll talk about very briefly today. Now, as I promised, just one more deciduous tree before we get to those pines. But as I've been walking around my neighborhood, and also especially around Central Park, something that keeps popping out to me are these trees where I see leaves still being held onto the trees. Do you notice that in this tree here? There's something funny at the bottom, sort of along the trunk there. And this is an oak tree, and it's still holding on to its leaves, which seems a little odd, right? Has anyone else been noticing that? You see it also a little bit on beech trees. And it's odd because the leaves definitely look brown and dead, and so they're not photosynthesizing anymore or making food for the tree. So why is the tree holding on to them? Well, it turns out there's sort of an evolutionary reason for this. So oak trees are pretty old, evolutionarily speaking. When trees were first on the planet, actually all trees were evergreen trees initially. And I said ginkgos were pretty old as well. Somewhere later along the tree evolutionary line are oaks, but they are earlier than later, more evolved species such as maples, aspens, and birches. And so as trees evolved over time and tree species sort of spread their range of where they could grow, they encountered different growing conditions in different places. And so they had to develop different ways of doing those things that trees need to do, such as growing and shedding their leaves. All trees shed their leaves just at different times, not all of them all at once, like we'll see with the pines today. And so oak trees, we're not exactly clear if there is an advantage to why they do this, but they do not necessarily shed all of their leaves. This holding on to the dead plant matter is called marcescence by botanists, as opposed to abscescence is when they drop the leaf. But it's something that you don't see on later, more evolved trees. It's also something that you see more commonly with younger oaks, and usually on lower branches. So definitely keep your eyes out. Once I read this, now I'm seeing it everywhere on lower branches of oaks, and they tend to be somewhat smaller oaks than some of the other ones around them. Of course, the squirrel must really appreciate that oaks do this. I'm guessing that perhaps oaks are squirrels' favorite trees because they get to use these leaves if they need some more for their dray or their nest. And of course, they also appreciate that oak trees also provide acorns into the winter. All right, but let's get into the Pinetum and start talking about pine trees. And just at a glimpse, we can see how green it is over there in the Pinetum. So we'll carefully cross the drive and make our way over there. And here we are at the Arthur Ross Pinetum. And this map gives us a nice clear sense of where we are and kind of where we are in relation to the reservoir, as well as some of the baseball fields of the Great Lawn, and in relation to the West Drive. So we can sort of locate ourselves here. Now, the other question, of course, that pops up maybe as soon as you hear about the Pinetum or when you see that sign is, who is Arthur Ross? Well, Arthur Ross was a businessman and a philanthropist, and he also was an especially humble man because it's not easy to find many pictures of him. I was trying to find some pictures of him in the park, but couldn't find any clear enough to share today. However, Arthur Ross has really been involved with Central Park very, very early on. So he initially planted pine trees starting in 1971. And we'll talk about how his initial focus was really to obscure the views of some unsightly maintenance buildings. But he made his money with the Central National Corporation that was produced chemicals as well as wood pulp. And sort of that is where he gained some of his knowledge of pine trees and his passion for pine trees. But also, it's important to note that Arthur Ross was one of the founding members of the Central Park Community Fund in 1974, which was sort of like an early precursor before the Central Park Conservancy was formed. So he has really been supportive of the park and the Central Park Conservancy very early on. Now, here we see, before the Pinetum was in place, there was a children's wading pool. Obviously, this isn't during winter time, this is during the summertime, and it does look like it was a whole lot of fun. But I think, there is still a playground located within the Pinetum. It's a unique playground, and there is no wading pool there, but there are fun swings. And when Arthur Ross began working on the Pinetum, originally he planted 35 pine trees and then added more each year. Again, first his focus was to obscure some of the more unsightly seeming maintenance buildings. But because of his knowledge and passion of pine trees and his close work with arborists and horticulturalists with the Central Park Conservancy, he continued to donate additional species. So more and more pine trees were added to this area over the years. And in 1997, the Central Park Conservancy restored this area, and now there are some 600 species or more of pine trees. He initially focused on our native eastern white pine, which many of you may be familiar with. We might see some today in the background, but I'm going to focus on just a few of the kind of more interesting species found from around the world that really stood out. So let's continue on our walk. We've just gotten into the Pinetum, and right away, I don't know about you, but this tree really calls out to me for my attention. It's kind of got a very interesting winding trunk, and the bark looks very oddly kind of peeling and interesting colors. So let's take a closer look here. Really great colors. It's very peeling and rough, and there's all kinds of colors in here, brown and green, tan, grays, even some sort of pink and orange tones in here. I wish I was good at watercolor painting. I think this would be a really interesting tree to paint in that way. But this is an example of an Austrian pine, and this is one of the features that it's known for. In addition to its interesting trunk growth, it's also known for its very interesting coloration of its bark and how it has this peeling nature. Now, in the tree just above us, as we're passing into the Pinetum, I believe this is an eastern white pine, but I know it's hard to tell from this picture. But there are some blue jays popping around in the branches. And of course, that's another great thing about all of these pine trees and evergreens, providing habitat and food and nesting sites throughout the cold winter months for so many of our birds. And here we had some blue jays hopping around, making lots of noise and showing a lot of activity. And I don't know about you, but doesn't it sometimes feel like you see so many blue jays in the winter time, even though they're actually, you see them in the summer as well. And so I looked into it, and it turns out some blue jays do migrate, but not all blue jays migrate. And they don't even necessarily do the same thing every year. There were some studies in the Northeast where they tracked a number of blue jays, and they found that 89% of the blue jays that they tracked actually stayed put for the winter. They didn't migrate anywhere. Now, I mentioned that some blue jays do migrate, and it tends often to be younger blue jays who go ahead and make that distance to migrate, but also is found in those tracked blue jays that many of them are creatures of habit, not unlike ourselves. I tend to go to the same bodega every time or a same store for certain things every time. And blue jays too, they tend to visit the same feeders and same feeding sites year after year. So perhaps many of the blue jays just know that Central Park is a really great place to feed in winter, and perhaps that's why we're seeing so many of them. Now, same thing if you've been walking around Central Park, or perhaps you've noticed in some of our weekly walks that we are also seeing a whole lot of tufted titmice right now and black-capped chickadees around the park. And they too, we see year round pretty much. But this is the time when they're feeding a lot. They definitely want to eat, as much food as possible. Also something I do during the winter time. So that may also be why they seem more active and you see them more in the park. Of course, the tufted titmice are also very curious, so they'll come and visit you more often. But let's keep going around on our walk of the Pinetum. And this tree also really calls out to us as we're making our way around the circle of the Pinetum now. This is a Tanyosho pine, or it's also known as a Japanese red pine. And I think you can kind of see exactly why it's called the Japanese red pine from the color of its bark, which is pretty distinctive. It's kind of a really orangey red brown color. Let's get a closer look. And it also has kind of a peeling texture, but it's much more papery than that Austrian pine. It's a little more delicate. And so this, of course, is Japanese, so this would be native to Japan. Its needles are kind of wispy and hair-like, and they really have quite a variety of colors on a single tree, even not just withstanding the unique lighting. Some of them will appear sort of bright green, and some of them more of a jade or darker green. And these are, of course, its darling pine cones. Very cute. Now, we're making our way just a little bit into the Pinetum, and then we'll keep going around the circle. And there was another species that really sort of stands out. It almost looks like it's leaning over and waving hello to us here. So let's take a closer look at that one. And it too has some really interesting bark, and that's where it gets its name. So this is the lace bark pine. Really interesting colors, not quite as peely as the Austrian pine or the Tanyosho pine, but very interesting layers of colors. And it also had a very interesting form that we saw here. Now, moving around the circle of the Pinetum, on our left on the path, I see some pine trees that look very familiar to me. Does anyone else ever spend any time in New Jersey or perhaps drive through the Pine Barrens of New Jersey? Of course, there are Pine Barren areas in other places of the United States as well. Sometimes in the south of the United States, you'll see pine trees like these. These are pitch pines. And they're definitely found throughout the New Jersey Pine Barrens, which I used to spend a lot of time with my family, and so they look very familiar to me. They're sometimes not thought of as very attractive trees. They're now today not really prized for their lumber, although I think in the past they have been associated with being used for railroad ties. But they are very unique, distinct trees, and I love that they have a strong association with an important local ecosystem here to New York City, the New Jersey Pine Barrens. And they also have an important function. They're very resistant to wildfires or forest fires. And in addition to being resistant, they can actually also regrow in some really unique ways. After forest fires, they can grow new shoots right from their trunk, which is kind of a unique feature. Now, one way when you're learning how to identify pines, different kinds of pines, is knowing the number of pine needles that appear in a bundle or a fascicle. And typically these pitch pines appear with bundles of 3, but of course nature does not follow rules. So sometimes you'll find, with some of the pine trees that they'll appear in bundles of 2 or 3. But usually you can look at enough examples that you'll see the majority of them appear in the number that it says in the guidebook. But this is a great way to learn how to identify different pines. Now, here along the walk, I was not able to identify this specimen other than to say that it was sort of the Charlie Brown pine tree of the Pinetum, unfortunately. But my guess is that it's a very unique specimen, and that is why we are keeping our fingers crossed and giving it all of the love and care, I'm sure, from our arborist team at the Conservancy to hope that it gets tall and strong very soon over the years. Now, the great thing, of course, about evergreens is that they persist through winter. And so I'd like to launch a poll to see what we all do as people, because we also have to persist through winter, and what sort of strategies do we use to do that? So how do you make it through winter? Just like a pine tree. What do you find to be the most helpful thing for you to persist through winter? Of course, trees need to get sun, but they also, evergreens protect their delicate leaf tissue and those rolled up needles that can withstand frost and ice. But then, they are also, because they still have their needles throughout winter, they can still photosynthesize and make lots of food. And I think that the pine trees also probably benefit from visitors, as long as we are respectful of the trees and we're keeping out of fenced off areas. I think trees also benefit from visits from friends. And if you have something else that helps you through winter and helps you persist in these cold winter months, go ahead and share it in the chat and let us know what helps you make it through winter and persist just like a pine tree. It looks like so far the majority of us get an excellent winter coat and boots to protect themselves against cold and ice, which is great. But lots of us also get as much sun as we can, and that is really important. So if you are up for getting some sun when the sun is out, even if it's behind the clouds, you can come into the park if you're able, or go to your nearest local park if you're not here in New York City. All right, great. Now, as I mentioned, one of the first reasons that Arthur Ross planted the pine trees was to obscure maintenance buildings like this. So even though we can still see that maintenance building, obviously the pine trees have their own advantages now. All right, so we'll continue to make our way around the circle here. And you'll notice there's a center circle of the Pinetum that you actually can't enter. There is no path, and it is all fenced off. And I think that's really good, because that is especially protective of the tree specimens that are in that inner circle. And it also must be just a really perfect place for wildlife and birds to be, and it just sort of exist and nest without any disturbance from people or dogs. They can just sort of enjoy the quiet and peacefulness in that space. But I do like to look in that inner circle and just sort of imagine what it might be like to be in there, in that especially inner circle of peacefulness in the Arthur Ross Pinetum. Now I see a little path off to our left of the circle, and it looks very inviting to sort of further investigate. So let's take a look. And there's a nice little encircled rustic bench where we can sit. I also noticed this flowering shrub here, which it almost looks like it has flowers. I'm not sure if that could be possible in January, but let's take a closer look. It is flowering, and this is a winter jasmine plant that does winter about November through March or so. And it's a really nice little pop of color during the cold, dreary days that we sometimes see in wintertime. So I appreciate it. Similar to all those pine trees giving us some green and color, this winter jasmine is kind of brightening up our winter day. And we can take a seat on the bench and just take a moment to relax and reflect on the Pinetum and appreciate what it is and what it provides to us, as well as these evergreens, and breathe in those healthy pinene and terpenes from the pine trees, and just take a little break in our forest bathing that we're experiencing here. All right, but it is cold, so let's keep moving, and we'll make our way around that circle. And just off in the distance, we see the Great Lawn with a beautiful New York City skyline in the background. So let's take a closer look there. And we see the Great Lawn. And of course, the Great Lawn is closed for the season to rest. I kind of wish that I had a t-shirt that says this, that said I was closed for the season to rest, but I don't. But the Great Lawn, this is a really nice time for our lawns to rest during winter time. But it seems that these Canada geese did not get the memo. They did not read the sign that the Great Lawn is closed for rest. And it appears that this is some sort of Canada Goose World Series that they have organized here on the baseball field. All right, so we have come to the end of our walk today, our short little walk through the Pinetum on a gray day, but I hope you can see that even on a gray day, there is a lot to come and appreciate in the park. Now, this was just a very brief glimpse at just a few of the many interesting and beautiful species that are here in the Arthur Ross Pinetum at West 85th Street. And if you're really interested in learning much more about the Pinetum and taking a longer walk, check the chat for a link that Desiree will be sharing to our winter tree walk that will be happening this Saturday. That will be led by me this Saturday at 2 p.m. You can sign up for our winter tree walk, and you can also watch out for other times that we're offering that throughout the winter. But I want to thank you all very much for joining me again for our weekly walk and walking through the Pinetum with me. I'll keep this open and hang out for a little bit longer just to make sure that all of your questions are answered. But I want to thank you again so much for joining us and continuing to support the Central Park Conservancy and continuing to support the park. We really appreciate it. But from all of us here at the Conservancy, thank you, stay safe, be well, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, everybody.